Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my video of my watercolor painting, Fishing. Fishing? Yes, this bear was fishing. So we artists do a lot of looking around, and the key word is looking. Constantly looking for ideas, looking around for sources of inspiration. I was looking around on Facebook, and I came across a friend's page. Now this friend was a photographer who traveled all around, and she is an excellent nature photographer named Chris Cooper. She went to Alaska, and there she ran into some bears fishing in some beautiful waters and catching fish. This picture just stopped me in my tracks, and I decided I would really like to paint it. Now, friends, do the right thing. If you come across a picture by an artist on Facebook or anywhere else, ask them for permission. Don't just copy it. Ask them. It's their work. In this case, I asked her. She said yes, and I thank her very much for that. Make sure that you give credit to the artist as well. That's important, and we all like our credit, me included. I hope you enjoy the video and give it a like. And now let's paint. I have never painted a bear in any kind of action pose before, so I took a lot of time making this sketch. The next thing I did was deciding to preserve the whites so I could be nice and fresh where I wanted to be with my color and my fur strokes, as well as with all the white in the water. So I'm using masking fluid to preserve my whites and help mark out where I want to build the structure of this bear's body and fur. Around the edges where the sunlight is catching his fur, the snout, some areas of the eyes, some gleam in the nose of the bear. And then all that white water where he's splashing about in a river, looking to catch some dinner fish. There was a lot of white water showing, so I put in a lot of masking. You can always paint it over if you do too much, but it's hard to bring back whites. Actually, that's something I'm going to be doing a little later in this video. I'm using an ink pen to put in some fine detail masking fluid at this point. And that works okay sometimes, and other times it gets clogged up pretty fast. I did bring out some rubbing alcohol next to try that on the water and see if it gave me a texture after I painted the color on where there was no white foam. I used a mixture of intense blue, Hooker's Green Dark, and some Payne's Gray. And I got the shade of the color pretty close to the photograph, which I found attractive and I really wanted to match. After the water was painted on, I sprinkled on some rubbing alcohol drops to see what they would do. But dang, I don't think they did much of anything. They can make a beautiful texture, and I probably will experiment some more with that later. Here I am sprinkling it on with my brush. I see a couple little blotches, but I'm not seeing much drama there. So maybe I did something wrong. Putting some shading into the water as well. And I'm trying to make the bear's body showing through with some darkness here and there. I'm not sure what it's going to look like when the masking comes off, but it's interesting right now. Now the background. The shore of the river. And I'm going to skip the rocks and come back to them when that's a little drier. And in the meantime, I'm trying to paint a blurry, soft focus background. What was back here was some big tall weeds and marshes, a field with some grasses. So I wet it all down before I started painting because I want it to look blurry. There was some good strong sunlight in this picture, and that was lighting the bear up a little bit, around the edges mainly. I'm showing the sunlight with some yellow and some yellow ochre, some sap green, and then using Payne's gray to make some blurry rocks in that field. Where it's getting a little darker, I'm mixing in some sepia. The background of the photograph was so blurry I couldn't even tell exactly what was back there. Some sort of gray, rocky outcrop, perhaps. So I just kept it very loose and easy. Put in the marsh grasses next. I'm bringing in some burnt sienna and some yellow ochre into the marsh grasses. My thought was, let's match some bear colors into those marshy grasses too, not just greens and yellows. At the base of the grasses, it was much darker, so I mixed in some indigo and some sepia with some Hooker's Green Dark. I made some vertical strokes and some diagonal strokes and tried to keep it random for these grasses. Next, I'm moving on to the rocks between the field and the water. I'm outlining them, keeping the whole thing on the loose side. And once they're outlined, I'll come in with some water and wash out and blend and shade the edges. I'm making the rocks random in size and the darks between them where the shadows are. A little more work on the marsh grasses. I could just see the bear coming out from between them along the field and heading toward the water. What a sight that must have been for the photographer and her group. The paw is emerging from the water in the photograph, so I'm starting to shade it. Bears have long toes and claws, and I didn't want it just to be a brown blob, but I wanted it to be a formed thing. And now I'm beginning to form the bear's face, where his ears set on his face, where his head stands out a bit from his neck, where some of his muscular ripples go down and separate his back and his chest. All these areas go in and out, and where they're going out, they're lighter because they're catching more light. Where they go in, they're darker because they're recessed. I'm using yellow ochre for my lighter parts of the bear's face and fur. Oh, that face and muzzle, That was the hardest part for me of this whole painting, getting everything right. The bear's head was on an angle, and all the features sat on an angle. And there was a lot of adjustment. At first I made the eye too high, and the nostrils slanted the wrong direction, and I had to reverse all of that by rubbing out paint gently with a damp brush and blotting with a paper towel. Meanwhile, I'm just painting it in. I usually do paint with the lighter colors first and come in with the darker accent colors second. Have you ever painted animals yourself? What kind have you enjoyed painting? Have you ever seen a bear in real life? Maybe at the zoo? Maybe at a park? I've seen a bear several times in the Pennsylvania Pocono Mountains when we were camping. And once I saw some bears at Yellowstone National Park when we were camping there. Pretty amazing and beautiful animals. Not anyone I'd like to mess with personally, though. Now I'm going back to the rocks and I'm softening around those outlined edges with plain water. Softening where the rocks were painted, bringing the color into the interior, and trying to preserve some light and some shadow according to where the sun is toward the back of the painting and above. Also bringing in a couple different colors to add some interest. A little yellow ochre, a little bit of blue, and some burnt sienna. Working on the nose of the bear. Bringing in some more shadowing, and I'm always trying to show the hair with small individual choppy strokes of the paintbrush. You know, an animal's nose sits on several planes. It sits along the top of the muzzle, and then it curves underneath along the front of the face. I've studied animal noses way up close in many different photographic references. I've actually even looked at my dog's nose and cat's noses up close because they all have a rather similar structure. And that's a good teacher. The bear's mouth was open just a little bit, so whenever I worked around his mouth, I used a very tiny paintbrush so I didn't mess up. There were some strong shadows around the eyes and around the muzzle, as well as inside the ears. And I'm paying close attention to that and looking at my photograph the whole time I'm working. Now I'm looking at my angles, and I realized I had them wrong. I had to drop the lower left eye, which meant I also had to drop the lower left side of the nose, and the nostrils on that side needed to be lower as well. But I was able to make those small adjustments and get the anatomy more correct on this bear. Which only goes to show, don't give up on a painting just because you made a mistake, because quite possibly it could be fixed. Watercolor is a little more flexible than most people think. So if you ever painted an animal, what was the hardest part for you? The fur? The nose? And how about in the painting? Were the rocks difficult to make? Water? I'd like to hear what you think. You can always write in comments. So I'm using a small brush to continue to develop the shadows, the eyes, the hair, the fur, and the placement. And I'm almost at the point where I have things to my satisfaction, and the masking can be removed from the water and on the bear. And off comes the masking on the water and over the bear. There was a lot of it. This is going to be interesting. Do you use masking? What do you think of it? Useful or just a pain? It seemed needed here, but now I've got quite a lot of water, white water, to develop. I sort of like the white showing all around the edge of the bear. It brings in a nice sun feeling. With the masking off the bear's face, I'm now using a very small brush to detail around his eyes, the fur around his eyes and the actual eyes. The shape, a white sparkle on the eye. And now I'm painting in tiny hairs around the edge and leaving some whites, just sort of sparkling along the edge of the bear. What do you think of those whites? Some of them I blended into the background a bit, but I did try to leave a lot of them because I liked how it looked. Now I'm taking a very sharp little tool, a metal tool, and I'm scraping into some areas around his eyes and his nose to bring back whites. I'm also working a lot on his mouth. His mouth had some gleam in it because it was wet. So I'm scraping off a broken line along where the gum is to make his lower part of his mouth stand out. I'm scraping a white gleam into his eye, and I'm also scraping around the lower lid of the eye, which is glistening slightly. Where each nostril shows, I'm scraping off a little bit of paper and paint to show the white of the paper, where there's a little bit of glisten on his nose. And then I'm going back with my brush and doing some blending to make it all fit together better. The white of paper can be restored entirely if you're willing to scratch some of the paper off. Some artists use a razor blade and some use a knife. But I found my little scratching tool works very well for me and gives me the most control because it has a point. Now you don't want to scratch so deeply that you put a hole in your paper, but you can scratch off a couple layers and just add a little sparkle here and there without too much difficulty. Back to the water, I'm softening all the places where the white meets the color, and I'm doing that with a damp brush. because I don't want the water to look hard. I want it to look soft and flexible and foamy. Some of the white I'm painting over and subduing to make it more subtle. Where the light is hitting it on top, I'm going to try to keep it as light as I can. So here you see me blending it out a little bit. And then I'm trying to give a little structure to the water that he's splashed up and that's falling in front of his chest. This was not particularly easy, but it sure was a challenge. Did you ever work with splashing water like this? What tricks helped you? What I'm trying to do is give some directionality lines, break the water up with little dots of color here and there, and soften the edges. And that was part of the whole thing I liked about this photograph was the action of it, the action of the water, and the way the bear is emerging from behind the splashing wave. So that was my challenge, because I'd never done much with painting animals in action before, particularly a bear. I worked in that water for a long time, and then I went back with my little sharp scratchy tool again, scratched off some sparkling water drops in the water where I wanted some fresh white to show. I scratched off a couple more tiny little dots of water too to make more splash marks against where the bear was. Some final adjustments on the bear's eyes. This bear had such a human-looking expression on his face. I wanted to capture the whimsical characteristic of it and make it look just right. What an interesting challenge. These last-minute adjustments are necessary and take a lot of assessment from a distance. Step away from the painting, look at it from a little distance, and then get back to it. Finding a place to sign your name that will fit in and look natural. And I think I found just the right one. bit of more shading around the rocks. I can't stop. I just have to keep tweaking and adjusting. And finally go back to sign it in the right spot. I hope you enjoyed my video, fishing. It'd be great if you give it a thumbs up. And if you ring the bell on the links below, sign up and subscribe, and you won't miss any future videos. There's more links below too, to my Facebook art page, my blog, products I like to use, as well as my own art products that I make. If you've ever seen or painted a bear, let me know about your experience. I'd love to see or hear about it, and your comments of any kind are appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.